I will teach you how to play the modern defense, and this is a very fun opening to learn just because you can basically use it against pretty much anything that white can play. So the modern defense usually starts after white plays pawn to e4 and then we play pawn to g6, and we want to go for a quick kingside fianchetto and castle here on the king side. But you can play this, as I said, against e4, which is going to be the main focus of this video, but you could actually also, if they play d4, also play this modern defense system. Although most of the time, after a couple of moves, they can still play e4, which is going to be more like the modern defense. But sometimes you can also get more into some King's Indian type setup, for example, something like this, which is the King's Indian. You can also use it if white plays pawn to c4, so that's really nice. You can basically use this against anything. But we will focus on pawn to e4 because most of the time, when you play the modern defense, they are going to play e4 and d4 together anyways. So yeah, you can pretty much use it always, and you will most of the time get this position. We are going to continue, of course, with developing our bishop, and there are a couple of plans here for white. In total, we will be taking a look at 4 different variations. The first thing I will cover is what to do if white pushes this pawn to e5 very early, which is not such a good move by white, but it's actually pretty common because players that don't really know the modern defense sometimes think they can try to punish it like this. There are also many other options where white plays f4, which is the Austrian attack. We're going to take a look at that as well. Sometimes they can also play a pawn to c4, which leads more to King's Indian type setups, or they can just start developing the knights. But first, we are going to take a look at this. So white immediately has a really strong center, and the main thing to keep in mind with the modern defense is that, okay, we are playing a very modern opening, meaning we don't put pawns in the center right from the start, but we do have to fight for the center, because if we don't do anything and we don't fight for the center, we are going to get a really passive position. And something like e6, for example, here, which is, I think, one of the most played moves, yeah, one of the most played moves here, is actually not such a good move. Because, okay, we are just thinking about putting the knight here and developing, but we are not doing anything about the really strong center that white is trying to build up. So my recommendation if white pushes e5 is to go for the attack, and we have to keep attacking the center until we can break away at the center and maybe even win a pawn. So we are going to play pawn to d6. And of course, immediately this is a problem for white because we can always capture, and if they recapture, we can take their queen and we can also take here. So most players will actually play pawn to f4 and try and hold on to the pawn, which is also not such a good move by white, but it's in a way logical that they want to try and play this. Sometimes they also play knight to f3, but yeah, here you already see the problem for white. We can take, and then we take the queen. And white can't castle, and we can just simply continue development and have a good position. Of course, if they take with the knight, it's pretty much the same thing. You just have to trade the bishop for the knight, and then you can go for this. So if they want to be safe, quote unquote, they have to play pawn to f4 so that they can protect here on e5. They can also always capture here, but usually that's not so good because you can just capture with the queen. And again, we have pressure here. We have an easy time developing the pieces. Sometimes even c5, we don't really have any problems. So f4, and we have to continue with the attack. So we are going to exchange. And of course, this is not so good by white because, well, again, they are losing the right to castle. So they have to take like this. And this is pretty much the same thing as we just had, with the difference that this f-pawn is gone, and also we now have our queen open attacking this pawn. So we are going to continue with the attack with pawn to c5. Again, just normal, we want to keep attacking this pawn. Most of the time white will play c3. If they play something else, let's say knight to f3, usually, yeah, you can take here. It doesn't really matter, for example, this variation. And in the end, they are always losing this pawn. So that's the entire goal. We want to keep chipping away at the center. So c3 is pretty much the only move, also one of the most played moves here, because white wants to keep the center strong. But again, we are just going to trade, and we again create this position. So this is the same thing we have now for the third time, but with the big difference that these two files have been opened up. So we have some room for attacking chances. So we have to keep attacking the center. We will play or knight to c6, attack this. We are attacking it twice. So yeah, white has to defend it, and now they don't really have many options, except, for example, playing something like knight to f3. They might also try bishop to e3, But in many of these lines, we are playing queen b6, and yeah, it's not really a good approach here by white either. So let's say knight to f3, and of course, if they want to defend it with the knight, we are going to pin the knight so they can't defend it. Most of the time, they will try to do the counter trick here, so that also our knight is no longer participating. So basically, by both moving our bishops, we have eliminated the knights from this position. And still we want to go and attack this. But now the question is, how can we add an extra attacker to this pawn? We don't have that many pieces. You might want to play queen b6, which is actually playable, but I would like to just add another attacker to this pawn. And I want to add the knight as an attacker. So my plan is to play knight to h6, and then in many lines knight to f5, and then we just have an extra piece attacking this, and maybe in the future we can also move the queen, move the rook, or even castle on the queen side. So that is why I would recommend knight to h6. And of course I know white can take this, but yeah, they are just giving away a bishop. We are also opening up here, so that's not such a good thing to do by white. Most of the time they will try to push. Sometimes they castle, but castling is pretty devastating because of course knight to f5, and all of a sudden everything is collapsing. Also the king is not very safe, and sometimes you can even win material. Let's say they push pawn to d5, you can play queen here with a check, and you can take this bishop as well. I mean, okay, we are losing the knight, but yeah, very interesting and tactical position, and the white king is very unsafe, and black is gonna win this in every single line. So this is how it usually goes. White tries to push here. Maybe they try to push before they castle, which is a little bit better because at least we don't have this check. We do have this check, but it's not so good because they can just block with the knight, and then also the bishop would be protected in this variation. So what we are going to play here is just pawn to a6, so we can chase away the bishop. You might get this trade, but of course again we are ruining the castling position. And now we have a very interesting move, queenside castling with a check with the rook, and now we can take here with a check, the knight can't recapture, and we can take this bishop and maybe get a position like this. But this is of course way better for black because the black king is fine here. This king is actually already under attack. The knight can come in, the bishop is targeting this. So very interesting position. So we are gonna take a new look at another position. So again, e4, g6, d4, bishop g7. But now we are gonna take a look at some variations where white doesn't push e5. And this is actually the most played line by white. So this is the one that is most important to remember, and that is what to do when white plays knight to f3. So of course we want to develop the knight and we want to castle, but we don't want to put it here right away because now white can play pawn to e5. We are losing some time. They have a strong center. We don't want to run into this. So we are going to play pawn to d6 because this at least stops white from having a good time playing this pawn to e5, and then that means we can also develop our knight. White will continue development. Multiple things are possible. We are just going to take a look at knight c3. You can also develop the bishop. It's pretty much all very similar. The plan for black is always the same. We can just put the knight here, and of course this pushing is no longer very strong because of course in many of these lines we are taking the queen, and then also we are winning back the pawn here, or at least just winning a pawn, not even winning back a pawn, just winning a pawn straight up. So that is why we want to play this d6 to make this impossible. Experienced players here will always play something like bishop to e2. Grandmasters also always play something like bishop to e2. So we are going to continue looking at that variation. Online you will probably see bishop to c4 even more frequently, but it's not such a good move because of castles, and we do have a nice trick here. Maybe you can see it. This is a common trick in these positions, and that is knight takes e4, they take back, pawn to d5. And of course we are temporarily sacrificing a knight, but we also have a fork. After they move, we can capture this, and then just complete development. For example, knight here, maybe the knight goes here, we can develop the bishop. This is an equal position, I would have to say, but at the same time, as black, we were able to destroy the white center. We still do have this active bishop. We can sometimes counterattack with c5. We can put the knight here on f6. So yeah, it's a good position, a fun position to play, I would say, for black. So experienced players will probably play bishop e2, maybe bishop d3. Those are a bit similar. So we can just continue, you can castle, white's gonna castle, and then here the question is, what are we gonna play as black? And at this point we have actually transposed into the Pirc defense or Pirc's defense. So if you're interested in studying this position a bit more in depth, I also have a video on the Pirc's defense you can watch. And my recommendation is to play pawn to c6, which is the check Pirc variation. And we basically do this because I want to launch an attack on the queen side. I want to go b5, a5, b4 and just launch a big attack over there. Because honestly, there's not much else to do in this position. We are not going to launch an attack on the king side, and the center will always be white's terrain. They are always going to be strongest in the center. So our only option basically is to go for some queen side attack. White might play something like pawn to h3 because they want to prevent us from pinning them, which is fine. Sometimes they will play e5, but usually that's not such a good move, of course, because always takes, and then we always have this simple plan. Okay, they can play bishop to f4, we can play knight to d7. Things can get a little bit complicated, but in the end, usually their entire center is going to collapse if they push pawn to e5. We are just going to continue with the attack. We are going to go for the queen side attack, pawn to b5. And white doesn't really have much of a plan here. The only real plan is to sometimes push e5, which we have already talked about, that it's not always such a good move. And this variation, of course, we don't have knight to g4. So if this happens, you probably just have to play knight back to d7. Or maybe trade queens and then play the knight back to d7. But other than e5, there's never really anything white can do in this position. White might try to stop our attack, but we are just going to continue with pawn to a5. They might develop the bishop. These are the most common moves. And we want to keep attacking on the queen side. But we have to be careful here, because if you push pawn to b4, you are immediately losing. Because of course, white can take this, and you don't want to capture this and lose your rook and get a position like this, because yeah, this is pretty devastating for black. We don't want this. So we have to be a little bit patient. So we are going to play knight to a6 first, which sounds strange because we are putting a knight on the edge of the board, but this knight is of course helping us with this b4 push, and also it's blocking this rook and it's protected by the bishop. So it all works together pretty well here. White can always push pawn to e5. Again, you can move the knight back, you can take, it's pretty much all the same. Or they can just continue with development. For example, something like queen d2 is also played here. And then we are going to continue our attack. Pawn to b4, they can take. And we want to take actually with the pawn. Because on all of these variations, we are trying to win the pawn on e4 if they didn't push it. And after the knight moves, all of a sudden we can try to win this pawn. And it's actually pretty common that if they don't push, we can try to win the pawn on e4 if we can kick away this knight. And if they do push, oftentimes because of this knight g4 plan or even the knight e7 plan, you can also try to win that pawn. So if you want more information on this position, you should definitely check out my video on the Pirc's defense as well. Next up, we are going to take another look at a similar position actually, but this is one where white plays an early pawn to f4, which is known as the Austrian attack, or in this particular case, the pseudo-Austrian attack. And the thing is, white has immediately a really strong center, and they are in many variations going to try and push e5. But now when they push it, they will have an extra pawn backing up that push. Of course, d6 always really important for us so that we can play the knight to f6. You might be thinking, well, what if they push here? Well, okay, we can take. They have to take. Most of the time, if they take with this, of course, they are always getting a position like this, or they have to capture with the king, and then you can just move the knight to d5. So you don't really have to worry about this. They can also try to attack here and take with the pawn. Then we have to move the knight, but you can move the knight to d5, opens up the bishop, we can still castle. So there's not really any problems here for black, I would say. Most of the time they are not going to push so early, they will just keep developing and building up some pressure in the center. And we will have to strike back, we will have to be aggressive, because if you just castle, which you can actually play, this variation is also covered in my Pirc's defense video, but sometimes the white attack can become a bit too strong because they just have all of the pieces in the center, they have all of the pawns in the center, and it can be difficult for black if white really knows what they are doing. So my recommendation in this specific variation is that we are going to play the Austrian attack dragon formation, which is the pawn to c5 early on. We play this pawn to c5, and this might look a little bit strange because you would think, well, if white takes this and we recapture, now we are suddenly the ones in trouble. And that's completely right. And that is why if white takes this, we won't be capturing back. We are going to try to play for tricks. So what you can play in this variation is queen to a5. And suddenly you will see we basically have two threats here. First of all, we might win the e4 pawn because this knight is now pinned to the king. Also, queen c5, we can just recapture the pawn with the queen. And just by doing this, we have actually eliminated one of the pawns from white in the center, and also our bishop is stronger now because this diagonal has been opened up. Most of the time, white's gonna play bishop to d3 and try to protect the center and just allow us to capture here on c5. Sometimes they will take here on d6, which is actually not such a good move, but the variations here are pretty funky, I would say. They are pretty interesting, but you have to know what you are doing from the black side as well. I won't cover all of this, but you can always check the top pinned comment, and then you will find a link where you can see all variations, even the ones that I won't be covering in this video. But most commonly they will play bishop to d3, which is the best move. And then you can just capture on c5 with the queen. And now white has a bit of a problem because they can't castle. They just can't castle because otherwise they would be putting their own king in check, and that's illegal. So pretty much white is forced to play queen to e2, bishop to e3 because that's the only way they can castle. But by doing so, we also gain a little bit of time to castle ourselves, and after they attack us, we just go back to a5. And again, this pins the knight, and there can be tricks sometimes because the knight is pinned. Now, finally, white can castle, and we can just continue, for example, bishop to g4. Usually your bishop, your light squared bishop, is not very good in all of these positions, but if you can just put it here and trade it for the knight, usually that's a good thing, because our bishop is a bit useless, and this knight was actually a good piece, targeting some squares in the center. And this is where I will end the theory on the Austrian attack after knight to c6, but this is very pleasant from black because, of course, we were able to castle, we were able to develop all of our pieces, we have some pressure with the queen, we might be able to go for an attack here on the queen side, we have open files for the rook that we can use, and there's not much white can do in the center. So that is where we are going to end this variation. And then there is one more thing we need to talk about, which is a very funny line, and that is e4, g6, white plays d4, bishop g7, and white just plays c4. And white just says, I'm going to put all of my pawns in the center, like this. And this most of the time leads to some kind of King's Indian defense, because we are going to play our pawn to d6, and most of the time, of course, knight to f6, castle, and that is just going to lead to the King's Indian defense. Sometimes white can actually play pawn to f4 as well, and even though this might look a little bit scary, it's actually not such a good approach by white, because they are in a way overextending. They are just pushing too many pawns, not developing any pieces. And most of the time, for example, after a variation like this, they want to develop the knight. You always just have to strike back in the center here with c5. They can push. And this is also something that is covered more in depth in the King's Indian defense, which I also have a very good video on. So if you want to learn that, you can also watch the King's Indian defense video. If they play knight to c3, of course, we are just going to develop our knight. And the thing is, they, again, never really have this e5 push, of course, because of this. And then always knight to g4. Yeah, and it's not really such a good line for white. So most of the time they will play knight to f3, we can castle, they can play bishop to e2. And I always recommend here to play this e5 push. And basically there are two variations here. White can push, or white can ignore this and they can castle, which are the orthodox variation and the Petrosian variation of the King's Indian defense. And if you want to learn more about this, I would recommend that you go check out my King's Indian defense video. And I hope that with this video I was able to show you some of the basics for the modern defense, which I really think is a very interesting opening if you are looking to play something that you can use against pretty much anything white can throw at you. But at the same time, I also have to warn you that if you want to play this modern defense, you really have to study a lot of opening theory, in my opinion, because you have to know the Pirc defense, you have to know the Austrian attack, the four pawns attack, you have to know the King's Indian defense as well, and also some extra variations like, for example, the early e5 push. So I think it's definitely worth putting your time into this and studying these different openings, because basically you will be combining about 4 or 5 openings from black into one weapon that you can use against everything. But in the beginning, if you try this out, you might get some bad games where you lose quickly or you make some mistakes, but you just have to keep learning, keep looking at some theory for the other openings that I mentioned, and in the end, you will have a really strong weapon you can use against anything. That's it for this video. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.